Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. There has always been an underlying assumption, at least in our contemporary debates, that nations that trade together are less likely to go to war with each other. In a very real sense, that's generally been true. Such was a lot of the practical and political impetus for the wave of globalization that has swept this century. But today, trade itself has become a face of war. All over the world, trade wars seem to be heating up. Whether they might escalate to hot wars is an open question. But for now, simply trying to understand the trade wars themselves is valuable. A listener approached me recently and said he just wished there was some way to really understand what's going on with this debate about trade. What's at stake, he asked. Who's really paying the price? How will it really impact our wallets? And who's to blame? All good questions. And to help us understand this, I'm joined today by my guest, Howard Shatz. He's a senior economist at RAND and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He has a Ph.D. in public policy from Harvard, has studied international policy and management and Middle East studies at Columbia, and has done postgraduate work at Tel Aviv University and at Brown University. Before joining RAND, Dr. Shatz was a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California and held research fellowships at Brookings, at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and has worked as a consultant to the World Bank and for nations in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Howard Shatz to the Who, What, Why podcast. Howard, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
The idea of trade, nations trading, is certainly not a modern invention. It goes back literally thousands of years. Talk a little bit about the modern reinvention of trade and a little bit about how it's evolved.
You're right. It does go back thousands of years, and we have evidence of that from shipwrecks, for example, in the Mediterranean, and from records of the Great Mongolian Empire throughout Eurasia, where people could trade freely or could move freely across a vast land area. But the modern invention of trade, we would date to the late 18th century. I'll go through two iterations. The late 18th century, early 19th century, with the invention of the steam engine, and then the application of that to shipping. So that vastly lowered transportation costs. One of the reasons that it's difficult to trade is because you have to move a good from one place to another. And throughout most of human history, that's been very expensive. Again, if you go back into the medieval times, you'd see these records of trade fleets going from Europe to China and back, and they would take years, and they would be extremely expensive. So you would need to transport very high-value items. But once shipping prices fell, right, you could transport lower-value items. What did that mean? That meant that for a consumer in one country, goods that could be produced more efficiently or at lower prices in another country were more available. So trade expanded dramatically in the 19th century. By the period just before World War I, the world was highly globalized. Not only were there extensive trade links throughout the world, but there was a lot of investment moving cross-border too. And we really didn't reach that level of globalization until the 1980s, 1990s. So what happened in World War I? World War I broke apart the world trading connections because it was the entire world at war. And then we entered into the 20s and 30s, where leaders tried to reconstruct that, but countries were struggling economically. And we went into a downward spiral of trade restrictions, currency devaluation, and that really put the seal on the end of the first big phase of globalization. Now, in the 1930s, we'll date the modern era to the 1930s. And the reason I want to date it to that is because U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull spearheaded something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, right? And what that did was early in the 30s, under the Roosevelt administration, he saw that it would be helpful to the U.S. economically to start to restore some of those trade links, to start to bring down some of those trade barriers that we think of most emblematically from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the U.S., but the U.S. was not alone in instituting very high barriers. So Secretary Hull and U.S. Congress, through the passage of that act, started negotiating trade agreements with other countries to bring down tariffs. This was all interrupted by World War II, and again, World War II broke up the world trading regime. right? And then after the war, the victors, primarily the U.S. and the U.K., decided they needed to restore world trade and basically restore the international architecture and build new institutions that would help the world recover. There were three institutions that provided the basis. One was the World Bank, which was at first designed to help Europe recover. The second was the International Monetary Fund, which was designed to help countries with balance of payments problems. So what happens if you owed too much money to another country and couldn't pay it? Right? And the third institution was supposed to be a formal trade institution. Now that didn't get passed. What we ended up with instead, and which served the world until 1995, was something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. The GATT went through several different global negotiating rounds and expansion of membership. And each time these rounds occurred, tariffs and other trade barriers were lowered. And there were two bedrock principles behind the GATT, and they were really the bedrock principles behind the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Agreement Acts. These were national treatment. You had to treat foreign countries the same way you treated your domestic companies, and something called most favored nation. Right. Most favored nation has been misinterpreted. It means, it's been misinterpreted to mean that we are treating someone, say China, better than we're treating anyone else. We're treating them as a most favored nation. What it actually means is if I have a trade agreement with 100 countries, right, and I extend most favored nation privileges to a country, that means that I have to treat them as well as my best treatment to another country. So if I have a trade agreement with China and the United Kingdom, and I say that my tariffs on cars from the United Kingdom are 5%, and I'm treating China as most favored nation, I can't make tariffs 20% on Chinese cars. I have to make them 5%. Right? The same as the UK, the same as most favored nation. Now, there was I would point to one other major event. It's not really an event, but a trend before 1995. And 1995 presents a break. But the trend before that was a technology change trend. And we often will look at trade institutions and trade policy and focus on that. But in many ways, it's swamped by technology changes, just like most of the other things that are happening in the economy, domestic and international. What was that technology change? Well, it was the advent of what's called containerization. So instead of loading goods in different types of boxes and pallets onto a ship, you would put goods into a container. It looks like the back of a large cargo truck on the road, and you would stack those containers on ships. So when people look at the port of Oakland, for example, or they look at the port of Los Angeles, port of Long Beach, they see these very large cranes that look like Imperial walkers from Star Wars. And in fact, my understanding is that the Imperial walkers are modeled after what these cranes look like. All right. So this lowered the cost of shipping in an extraordinary way. Right. And there's a good book about this called The Box, but we should always pay attention to technology changes as well. Let me go back to policy, and that was in 1995. The trade institution that the post-war generation had envisioned finally came into existence, and that is the World Trade Organization that absorbed the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and had a number of other agreements in it as well, such as a government procurement agreement, a General Agreement on Trade and Services, an agreement on trade-related international property measures as well. So that takes us up to the current trade war.
I want to go back a little bit and talk about, particularly in the pre-World War period, the tariffs that were imposed at that point, and what was, because that's a good example, what was the rationale for those high tariffs at that point, and for Smoot-Hawley and the things that were part of that period?
19th century tariffs were the main source of revenue for the federal government. We didn't have an income tax. Right? When you get into the post-income tax era, so income tax is 1913, you then get to the period that you asked about. This is a worldwide phenomena, And what countries were seeing was that their economies were suffering. And so what did policymakers want to do? Policymakers wanted to help their domestic producers. They thought that were they to institute tariffs, so I will put a barrier on goods from overseas, that will help my domestic producers. Why will it help my domestic producers? It will make the goods from overseas more expensive. Right? So, in a very abstract way, if some item from overseas would cost me $1, and I would put $1 tariff on it so that it would then cost $2, and my domestic producers could produce that for $1.50, then they can compete, right? Whereas if I don't have a tariff and the foreign good costs only $1, my domestic producers can produce it for $1.50, they can't compete. Everybody will want to buy the imports if the goods are the same, right? So the rationale was we will protect our domestic producers, and that will boost our economy. And in some ways, it would cause improvements in things that we could see visibly. So if I put a tariff on steel, that might help steel companies compete, and I could look at steel companies as they increased production and hired more workers. Right? But there are things that we would not see, or second and third order effects. And so one of those more distant effects would be that companies that use steel in their products would then be paying higher input prices, all right, and would be less competitive on the market, so maybe they would have to lay off people. Likewise, foreign governments would retaliate as well. So I've just helped my domestic producers producing for the domestic market, but my producers who are exporting are going to be disadvantaged when other countries retaliate. So what happened was this downward spiral occurred throughout many countries of the world.
I want to talk a little bit about the other side of that, which is that in an age that is more globalized, particularly with the free flow of money around the world, which really increased dramatically in the 60s, the other side of that, which is countries that encourage exports, also is a way of encouraging the domestic economy. Talk about that.
Right. So you're right to peg that in the 60s, and we should peg that in part to California. Starting in the 60s, it was the California technology firms that realized that they could produce in Asia for less. And Singapore was the original site, or one of the original sites for this. Singapore provided low wage rates, pretty educated, skilled labor, and rule of law. So that kind of got things started. It became much easier to move money overseas, to make investments overseas. Throughout the 60s, countries were concerned about too much foreign investment, and it was also sometimes their what were called their capital accounts were closed, so it was difficult to make investments in countries. What we really saw in the 80s and 90s was a dramatic lowering of barriers to investment. One big reason we saw that dramatic lowering was because of the success of what are called the Asian tigers. So the little Asian tigers were Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and if I didn't have to think of it, I would immediately think of the fourth, but unfortunately I can't think of the fourth. And it will come to me later. Now, what did these countries do differently? So in the 50s and 60s, a lot of countries were trying to develop through what is called import substituting industrialization. They were putting up high tariffs, hoping that they could spur domestic industry. And in some cases, this was quite absurd. You had small countries trying to develop a car industry, right, without hope of exporting those cars. You need a big market to work at scale, to produce cars efficiently. So these countries did not develop well. You had the four Asian tigers following Japan, right, who took a different view. They focused on exports. Right. Now, Japan was mostly with domestic producers, but we get into the tigers, and they had, in some cases, foreign investment, right? That was producing for the world market. it has become much easier to do that. In fact, when we look at trade agreements, so if we look at NAFTA or other so-called free trade agreements, right, those are in part investment agreements. Right? They have investment chapters. They make it easier for countries to invest in each other. So investment barriers lowered, trade barriers lowered. It became much easier to produce in one place and ship back to the home country. And here we get into the technology changes again. It became much cheaper to produce in one country, ship those inputs to another country for assembly, and then ship those inputs to a third country for final sale. Right? And so you needed all three of those things going on. It also became much easier to transmit information. Right, so a corporate headquarters in the United States or in Germany could easily communicate with its subsidiary or with a factory in Singapore or China or Malaysia. Right, you needed that too to really cause this explosion. We would call this production sharing or the creation of global value chains, and that is I will invest in a country or I will produce an input in one country, ship that input to another country, based on low transport costs, assemble all of the inputs into an item, and then ship those final items to America or Europe or even China or Japan or whoever else is interested in buying that product. So when we look at the dramatic expansion of world trade, right, it's not just one country selling final items to another country. The dramatic expansion of world trade has occurred in large part because of the input trade that's going on, and a lot of that input trade is going on because of the investment you mentioned.
And one of the things also going back to the 60s that seemed to have an impact on all of this is changes in banking, changes in the world flow of capital, which became much freer in that period.
That's exactly right. Now, so we go back to immediately after World War II, or before World War II, we saw what were called competitive devaluations. So I would devalue my currency, and that would make my exports more competitive. Right? And we saw a lot of these going on in Europe before World War II. That's part of the downward spiral that I mentioned. Right? After World War II, one of the things that that generation of geniuses, really, who created the international architecture wanted to do was to prevent those competitive devaluations. And so we had a very controlled international financial environment. And that's kind of what part of the role of the IMF. Currencies were pegged to the dollar. There was a gold-based exchange rate. It was not a gold standard, but gold was valued at, I think, $35 an ounce. And capital accounts were closed. It was, in many cases, difficult to invest in other countries. Watershed moment was when the U.S. withdrew from this arrangement under Nixon. Economically, it likely made sense to withdraw, but it eventually introduced an era of floating currencies where countries could adjust their exchange rates more easily. And that kind of central bankers, banks had to learn how to operate in that environment. In addition, we had the opening of capital accounts. So it became much easier to invest abroad. We saw this especially, so some countries in Asia were the vanguards of this. Dramatic trends in the late 80s, early 90s in Latin America. And Latin America had been one of the main sites of import substituting industrialization. But a lot of these countries had been stagnant, not growing, had various debt crises, and just changed the way that they looked at investment. And so they became open to investment also. And, in terms of transferring money, the banks were conduits. Right. I think it's not so much that banking changed, but of course businesses respond to incentives and they respond to opportunities. and the opportunity to move the money from point A to point B to facilitate investment opened, and banks certainly took advantage of that to do so.
The period that we have been in up until now, this focus on globalization and extensive trade, talk a little bit about what was the point at which we tipped into where we are today. Was it NAFTA? Was it before NAFTA? Talk a little bit about that.
So the point that we're at today, I would say there are two reversals. They're not quite reversals, but there are two issues that we're dealing with that look at the negative side of trade. And one issue is the effect of trade on workers. And so I'll talk about some of the roots of that. The other issue is the current trade war with China and China's behavior as a major trader also. So we'll peg that second bin as the rise of China. Let me start with trade and labor. So workers have always been concerned about the effects of trade. This is not new. And the idea is, if I am a worker in an industry and we lower a trade barrier to that same industry overseas, and they can produce things more cheaply, I might lose my job. Right? And, quite frankly, that's a reasonable concern. Right? And if I'm a worker who's lost my job, it's not very comforting to hear a policymaker say to me, well, yes, you lost your job, but the overall economy is larger, we're richer, we're more productive. My attitude, if I was a worker who lost my job, would be, yes, but why do I have to pay for that? Right? So this has always been a concern. And in fact, it was one of the reasons why the United States started something called trade adjustment assistance. And I think this has its roots in the Kennedy administration. And in fact, one of the negotiating rounds that I mentioned under the GATT was called the Kennedy round. So that was one of the trade barrier lowering rounds that we did. So we've had trade adjustment assistance. It really became much more prominent in the NAFTA debate. Now, NAFTA did affect workers, some workers negatively, but what's always left out, again, it goes to what's seen and what's unseen, right? We can identify workers who lost their jobs because of trade. It's much harder to identify workers who have gained jobs because of trade. Those would be workers who work in export factories. They would also be workers who work in companies that use imported inputs. And every country uses an enormous amount of imported inputs. And they'd also be workers who would gain from consumers having more disposable income because they're buying cheaper imports who could spend on other things. Right. So we had this debate in NAFTA. In truth, NAFTA was not large enough to have truly deleterious effects on the U.S. labor market. It did affect some workers negatively. There's no question. The next step was a WTO ministerial. So a ministerial is a meeting of trade ministers. And the WTO has regular ministerial meetings. The ministerial in I believe it was Seattle, and I believe it was 1998, resulted in protests and riots. And that was a big shock because the WTO was starting to deal with new issues, which were creating more unease, including investment, cross-border investment issues, among others. So that was kind of the second big shock. Then we get to China in the early 2000s. Right, the U.S. economy was doing pretty well in the early 2000s. Right, our trade with China was expanding dramatically, and so people were concerned about China, but in general, most people were doing well. But there was always this concern about trade and labor. Right, and then we get to the Great Recession. Right, so Great Recession badly affected employment. Right, we can't trace that back to trade, but the big concerns about trade stemming from the Great Recession were that countries would start to put up barriers, just as they had done in the precursor to the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s, right? And so the G20 leading economies all agreed that they would not create trade restraints. Right. This was as of 2008. Now, it turns out there's a very good group in Switzerland who's been monitoring this. It turns out that there have been thousands of trade restraints put on. These are generally small, right? And we don't necessarily see major effects on employment, right? The big effect on employment has been the rise of China. There have been some analysis that says this has caused large-scale layoffs. The papers are good. I think it's fair to say that increased trade from China has negatively affected some workers, a large number of workers. But again, it's the issue of seen and unseen and what trade would have looked like in the absence of China. So I think it's fair to say that trade has negatively affected some workers, and this is a long-standing issue. But this also leads to China, and so that's the other big bin that we're looking at. All right. So the rise of China is unprecedented. China has been the fastest growing large economy for the past 30 years. It is still a developing economy. Its per capita income in dollar terms, so if you were to take all of the income that is produced in China and divide it by all of the people who live there, they would each get about $8,000. In the U.S., per capita income is about $56,000, $57,000. Now, I'm not looking at distribution at all. I'm just looking at averages. But you can see, on average, China is still a poor country. But in the aggregate, China is a very rich country. China is the second largest economy in the world. The U.S. is about 20 trillion. China is about 13 trillion. China, if we were to count the European Union as one economy, China would be behind that. The European Union would be second. But if we look at national economies, China is number two. And this entry into world trade has been very dramatic. So what has happened, number one, China has become the largest exporter of goods in the world. So that means that other companies in the U.S. or Germany or elsewhere in Europe or anywhere else have a tougher competitor now. China has also become the site of a very large manufacturing ecosystem. So the production chains I was talking about before, a lot of that's happening throughout Southeast Asia and then sending inputs to China for assembly, and more China is using its own inputs produced in China to do this. Third, China is, because of its trade links, is building infrastructure around the world. It has an initiative called One Belt, One Road, where it is trying to link up Eurasia, Africa, all the way through to Europe. And there are concerns that it will use that to create higher barriers to trade from other countries, and that's always a concern. So I'd say those are the two new broad concerns. One is a heightened concern about the effects on labor, and second is a concern about the effects of China as a major player in the world economy.
What that doesn't take into account, though, is the lowering of cost of goods in the U.S., for example, as a result of this, and that's had an impact as well.
Right. So for example, take clothing. All right. Clothing now and shoes now are much cheaper than they ever have been. Right. That's a direct benefit to people who buy clothing and shoes, which is everybody. But it's especially a benefit to people at the lower end of the income scale. Right. So, someone in the top 10% of the income scale can buy expensive shoes made in Italy or expensive shoes made in the United States. Someone at the lower end of the income scale could certainly do that, but that means that it would take a large share of their income. With increased trade from China, from other parts of the developing world, those goods are now much cheaper. That also extends to inputs. Right? Inputs are cheaper too. So if I'm a manufacturer, right, and I use 30 different components, and I now get half of those components from China at a much lower price, I can lower my own prices for my final good. I can increase my sales. I can expand my employment. This is all well and good, except it comes back to, let's go back to clothing and shoes, right? Everyone in the U.S. benefits. but the people who would have produced clothing and shoes in the U.S. are not benefiting. So what do? Well, in some cases, they find other companies to work for. And in many cases, they earn a lower wage than they would have. In some cases, they get retraining, and they might end up earning a higher wage than they did. In some cases, they move. If we want to look at that just economically, moving, they can increase their wage, they can find a new sector, right? And that could be good. They might move and not be successful, and that would not be good economically. But then if we want to broaden this, and this comes back to some of the concerns about trade, and it needs to be recognized, right? If an adult in his or her 40s or 50s loses a job because of trade and has to move, they haven't just lost their job, they're losing their social network, all right? And they're losing their familiarity with the town or the city where they lived, right? And so there are social costs to this also. If we look just economically, trade almost always benefits a country. More trade benefits. If we look at it socially, there are costs and benefits, aggregate costs and benefits. For some people, it might be very good to move. For other people, it might be not good to move.
One of the things that we're looking at now beyond China, and China is a particularly unique case, as you so clearly explained, but much of the trade debate now is also focused on things like the EU as well. Talk a little bit about that.
The EU has tremendous market power. The EU is a very, very interesting economy, because in some ways it punches above its weight economically, it punches below its weight politically. Right. The EU is a terrific market, and one of the things that EU trade policy officials do is when they make trade agreements, they try to instill EU standards in the partners that they're making agreements with. And in fact, that's one of the concerns about China's increase is who will control standards. Now, the best recent example of the EU inserting standards isn't actually from a trade agreement. It's from a regulation that the EU passed called the General Data Protection Regulation. And this is about protection of data, privacy. People, I think most of our listeners, when they log into a website now, they're much more likely to see a notice about cookies. That all comes from the General Data Protection Regulation. And in fact, there's a law in California, a relatively new law, that's been modeled on that. So if we look at the EU's buying power, right, you could say, well, it's an EU regulation. I'm a U.S. company. I'm not going to bother with it. But if I want to sell into the EU, if I want to do business there, I have to honor that regulation. So then you could say, well, okay, I'm just going to honor it for what I do in Europe, but it's just much more efficient for me to just blanket honor it, which is why when you go to a U.S. website and you're a U.S. citizen based in the U.S., you might have to go through the same procedures based on the European General Data Protection Regulation. When we come to trade agreements, some of the issues that come up are trade in genetically modified organisms. So that's one reason that the U.S. and the EU have not been able to complete a trade agreement. Something called geographic indications. The Europeans want to make sure that anything labeled champagne actually comes from Champagne in France. Anything labeled Chablis actually comes from Chablis in France, that you can't label a California wine Chablis or Mountain Chablis, right? So that's another issue, and quite frankly, it would be extraordinarily beneficial to the U.S. and to Europe and to the world if the U.S. and the EU had a more formal free trade agreement. Right, but there are these barriers that stop them. So the EU has a lot of power that way. Whether it chooses to exercise that power, this is something that we're going to see. So until earlier this year, and I will bring this back to China, until earlier this year, the EU viewed China as a strong supporter of the international institutional system. So it was concerned about barriers in China, but like the U.S., but unlike the U.S., it viewed China as basically a foundation of the institutional system, including the trade system. Recently, the European Commission issued a report that changed that somewhat and said that China in some ways is also challenging the institutional system. And Europeans have been much more uneasy about it. So what we want to watch for in the future is will the EU use its market power in some way to try to change China, perhaps use that power differently than the U.S. is doing, but views now seem to be more similar to those of the U.S. The other thing about the EU, I should add, and just so listeners understand the institutional differences, we talked about NAFTA. NAFTA is a free trade agreement. So for all items covered under an FTA, when Mexico exports them to the U.S., there's no tariff. And when the U.S. exports them to Mexico, there is no tariff. But the U.S. can charge different tariffs on anybody outside the free trade area, and Mexico can charge different tariffs. So the U.S. can charge, a 5% tariff on cars, and Mexico can charge a 10% tariffs on cars, as long as it's not from the U.S. or Mexico. And so with free trade agreements, you then say, well, how do I prevent pass-through, right? How do I prevent people from sending their cars to the U.S. at 5% tariff and then sending them to Mexico at 0% tariff? We have something called rules of origin, right? A car has to have, or any item has to have a certain percentage made within the free trade area. And that's been a point of negotiation between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, rules of origin. The EU is entirely different. It's a customs union, right? Which means that there's not only free trade within that territory, but every single country has the same tariff. So if I export an item to France, I will pay a specific tariff on that item. If I export the same item to Germany, I will pay the exact same tariff. So I can't tariff shop, right? And we don't care about rules of origin, right? The only thing I, as an exporter, am concerned about is where's the market, where am I going to minimize my transport costs? So that's also how the EU is different. And there are a few other customs unions in the world, but the EU is by far the most sophisticated and the best of those. And many other countries will say we have formed a customs union or we are going to form a customs union, but very often there are internal barriers or other administrative issues that just don't make them a very good customs union. The EU has gotten it mostly right.
And finally, Howard, talk about trade wars and what history tells us about trade wars as it relates to the context of what we're seeing take place today.
And trade wars cause damage. Trade wars increase costs for everybody. They slow down the growth of GDP. But we shouldn't overestimate the effects, right? They can create a drag on GDP. At the level of tariffs we're talking, they are unlikely to cause recessions or certainly not depressions. They will just slow down growth, and sometimes that's hard to see, right? So what's the difference between an economy growing at 3% and an economy growing at 2.5%? For many people, it's difficult to see the difference. There is a difference, especially over time. So first, they create a drag on growth. Second, and part of the way they do that, and the second, is they will make items more expensive, right? But they will also disrupt trade patterns. Let me jump to the present. It's often, I think it's hard to apply, other than economic theory, what we know, the things I've said, GDP will slow, items will become more expensive, we will all be a little bit poorer. I think it's a little harder to apply history to the current situation because we haven't seen two economies of the magnitude of the U.S. and China engaged in such a trade war. All right, so in some ways it's what a statistician would call an out-of-sample prediction. We have all these things in the historical record, but we have something that's bigger and different. So what are we likely to see? We are likely to see in the era of production chains and value chains, we are likely to see those value chains change. We are likely to see production move out of China in some ways, and we've already seen firms are now looking at investing or moving their production to Vietnam or Bangladesh or elsewhere. We are likely to learn exactly what items we get from China that are not replaceable or that are hard to produce elsewhere. I think sometimes we don't actually know that it turns out some important input comes only from China, right? And so then how do you substitute for that? We are likely to see, especially in China, we're seeing this now, more calls to nationalism. I think the trade war is hurting China's economy, and so China wants to maintain growth for political stability, so China is calling on its population to hunker down. They can confront this. The U.S. is dealing with that less so. Because the U.S. has much more choice in terms of where it buys items, except for those items that it can only get from China. The big concern, and it's something you said something very interesting in the introduction, when we talk about out of sample, we have evidence. I wouldn't say this is strong evidence, right? We have evidence from the pre-World War II period that cutting off a country's opportunity to trade, cutting off a country's opportunity to growth, does sometimes get to be viewed by the country as a security matter. So it raises risk of confrontation. I won't say risk of war, but it raises risk of confrontation beyond economics. And we haven't seen this in decades because the post-World War II era was all about lowering barriers again and again. But we had, in the pre-World War II era, we did have the raising of barriers. And it was thought at the time that countries would not stand for economic opportunities being cut off. And what we're seeing in the world today, it's easy to look at U.S. actions, and these are unprecedented, and these will have an effect. But it's not just the U.S. It's the G20 with something on the order of 14,000 small measures that have raised trade barriers. It's China with not as open an economy as Europe and America, and signs that China is in some ways raising barriers, maybe not overtly. It is concerned about Belt and Road. Will that cause an increase in barriers? So in general, we see this slight raising of barriers around the world. Beyond the trade war. The trade war is a visible symptom of that, and the trade war is a very big step, but not the only thing that's happening here in terms of raising barriers. That said, the world is still more open than it was, say, in 1970 or 1980, possibly even early 1990. So we step backward, but we're still well ahead of where we used to be. The concern is that we'll continue stepping backward.
Dr. Howard Shatz, thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast and for helping shed some light on this whole range of issues. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. I was pleased to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.